Hi, this is Robert with Cruzbike, and today we're going to be assembling the new Cruzbike A4x. All right, when you receive your Cruzbike A4x, everything comes nicely packaged. As usual, we're going to fully remove everything from the box. The main frame should lift right out. Then we're simply going to remove all the packing very carefully. We'll surgically remove all the protective elements from the frame and get everything prepped for our assembly process. Please take note that the Cruzbike uses the Cane Creek Viscoset headset. It'll feel stiff, and that is by design, so please don't do any headset adjustments. We also have our handlebar set up here, pre-installed with our shifter and our brakes, our boom slider, chainstay and cranks pre-assembled. We also have our seat assembly and pad, and everything is in the box. We also have our parts box, which is important to go over all the elements here. We have some different instructions. You want to keep hold of those for the brakes. Also some information for your cranks and for the shock. Also in the parts box, we have some cable tips for when you do any cable trimming. We have a seat hardware bag with a spare derailleur. We want to keep that aside for when we do our seat install. We also have a couple skewers. Here's the first one. The skewers are for the seat back and the seat back bracket. Here we have our derailleur, which we will end up putting on our chainstay during assembly, and we will do an adjustment at that time. Also in the bag here we have a through axle. Now the rear through axle is in the frame already. This is the through axle for the fork and chainstay. You'll notice this one has the tool built in. You'll want to go over the instructions, and we don't want to over tighten this or put too much leverage on this tool. We'll cover that a little bit later. Also in the box we have our pedals, our nice standard pedals we like to use. Here we have our kickstand bracket. We'll go over that install at the end. We also have our seat bracket. This goes on the back of the seat and on the seat stay. Here we have a reflector set. You can put these on after we're all done on the rear seat stay and on the handlebar. Here's our other seat skewer. We'll set that aside for the seat install. And of course we have our chain, and the quick link should be in the bag with the chain, so be aware of that. And we also have our shifter cable housing. All right, it is not absolutely necessary for assembly, but here I'm going to be using our Cruzbike wheel stand. This is one of my favorite stands that we sell. We're also going to get out our Cruzbike toolkit. Make sure we have all the tools that we need. Everything should be included in here to assemble your bike, including some lube for the threads. The first thing we're going to want to do is take our drive wheel. It has our cassette on it. We're going to make sure the ends of the wheels are intact and we didn't lose them when we took the caps off during our unpacking. Note the stand has one side that's slightly wider than the other. That's the drive side. So we're going to set our wheel right in there. For our first step, we're going to simply put the entire frame and fork right over that front wheel. and line up our brake rotor with the caliper. We'll take our front end. Note our derailleur hanger is already installed at the end of the chainstay. We also have our boom clamp here and our slider clamp. All right, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to use our 5mm Allens, and we're going to remove the sleeve bolt and nut from the pivot bolt clamp. Now it's important to note the orientation of the washers. This is very similar to our other bikes. We want one washer on the bolt side, as you can see here, and these other two washers that are just being stored, we want to take both of those bolts and they are going to go on the sleeve side. It's very important that two washers go on the sleeve side, on the outside of the pivot clamp, and one washer goes on the threaded bolt. This will allow proper clamping of the pivot clamp onto the top of the steer tube. We're also going to crack open our lube here and put a little bit of grease on the pivot sleeve bolt. That's going to make it a lot easier to install and prevent seizing up over time. All right, so note I've taken our brake cable housing and we're going to put them in the middle, kind of between and underneath the pivot clamp. And we're simply going to slide the sleeve side with the two washers on the outside and the threaded side with the one washer on the outside. We're going to hand tighten this for now just so it's on there. Now we're going to attach our front chainstay to the fork using our long through axle. Now we haven't tightened our pivot clamp bolts down yet, and that's on purpose. That's so we can make sure everything is aligned with the front end when we put the through axle through. We're going to put a little grease on the threads. Now we're going to line up the chainstay and the fork and the wheel. Now remember that the wheel sits on the axle, not in the dropout of the fork. So you might have to move it around and lift it a little bit to get it in there, but everything should thread in nice and smooth once you're done. All right, our next step is to get out our derailleur, and we're going to install this onto the derailleur hanger. Now, a special note is the washer at the end of the derailleur bolt needs to be in the proper orientation. We're going to be using our 5mm Allen for this job, but note the washer at the end of the bolt. It's very important that this is in the right position. Otherwise, we will not get proper shifting. So note that the B-limit screw has to sit up against the tab. And then there's another tab located, and that tab goes on the back side of the derailleur. Once it is positioned properly, it can only go on one way. But if that washer is rotated, you might cross-thread the derailleur. So once everything's on there, it should look exactly like this. All right, now we have to set our end limits of our derailleur. This is a very important step. So on the underside of the derailleur are two bolts. We want to line up the jockey wheel with the cogs. So on the underside here, you can see at the end of the wrench there is a bolt. That's the end limit screw for the small cog. So using our Allen, we want to find that bolt under there, and we want to turn it until the cogs line up. So here you can see as I turn this, it's going to let that spring pull the derailleur over until I line up that first cog on the derailleur with the small cog of the cassette. We've also, before doing this, make sure that your through axle is tight. Otherwise, we won't get a proper alignment. Now we're going to push it the other direction after we pull the cage forward to clear the cassette, and we can see that we need to loosen the other limit screw. So the other limit screw will stop the travel going the other direction. So we want to loosen it a little bit and keep pulling that cage forward and testing the distance until we match the jockey wheel to the large cog, but not further, because we don't want the chain to come off of the cassette. So we keep making these small adjustments. Once we set the screw on one end, then we use the other screw to set the other limit, because we don't want the derailleur traveling further than the cassette. So that's the process here. Now we pull the cage forward, push that all the way forward and test that limit, make sure everything lines up on both ends. Very important step before we move forward with any type of installing of cabling or the chain. Okay, let's line everything up. So here we can use our rear axle to line up our seat tube and also our handlebar slider very easily if we just kind of sight down it. So we've lined up our seat tube to the axle, and now we're going to use a 5mm Allen to loosen our boom clamp. And then we're simply going to sight line down, and we're going to line all this up. So our boom lines up to the seat tube, and the seat tube is lined up to the rear axle. We can retighten our boom clamp for now, just to make sure everything's secure. And now our handlebar slider should be nice and lined up. We're going to use our 4mm Allen to remove the handlebar bolts and the clamps and install our handlebar. Note the handlebar goes in one way, and you can center the Cruzbike mark in between the clamps, and that'll give you a nice lineup for the handlebar. And when you tighten these handlebar clamps, it's very important to leave a gap. Do not tighten them all the way down. You want a nice even gap on the top and the bottom of each clamp. So once we get all our bolts in here, we can do an even tighten. We can rotate our bars basically so that the handlebar portion is pretty much kind of horizontal to the ground and slightly tilted. You can see my positioning here of where the Cruzbike logo is in between the clamps. You can attach yours in a similar fashion. Later when you do a fit, you might change this positioning a little bit, but this will get you in the ballpark. Now again, leaving a nice even gap top and bottom, we'll tighten our 4mm bolts a little bit at a time until our handlebars are nice and secure. All right, so we've moved the slider back a little bit. I loosened the boom clamp and moved it forward a little bit, so you can set yours up similar to this. And we're going to use two 5mm Allens to tighten our pivot clamp. Your exact setting might be a little different. This is a good starting point in order for us to get the cabling run, just as a general setup. The fit comes later on, so don't worry about that. But now that everything's secure, it's going to allow us to set our brakes. The first thing we want to do is we want to loosen the 5mm pinch bolt that's holding the cables. So we're going to loosen these bolts to release the cables on the front and the rear caliper. Now note the calipers are loose on the frame. That's an adjustment that we have to do later. We have to center the calipers and tighten those down later on. Once those cables are free, we'll be able to loosen them up a little bit to fit them in the brake levers. Okay, so now let's take a look at our lever. This is a very important step. The cam that holds our cable needs to be in the lower position, as you see here. If it is not, you simply rotate this knob until the flat side is facing upwards, and that allows you to move this cam to the upper position or the lower position. Again, we want the cam and the cable pull to be in the lower position. If it's not in the lower position, please make sure that you do this adjustment before proceeding. It will allow you to get the proper cable pull for the disc brake. If it's in the lower position, that's great. If it's not, simply do this adjustment and make sure it's in the lower position. Once it is, then we can attach our brake cables. The rear brake goes on the right side, the front brake goes on the left side, typically. Then we've turned our adjustments so the slots line up, and then our cable goes right in. We'll repeat that for the other side. Note the cable housing goes on the inside of the handlebar. We've checked our cam to make sure it's on the lower position. We line up our adjustment. Then we can simply insert that cable housing in there, tighten everything down. All right, so let's run our derailleur housing and cable. We're going to be routing it similar to the brake cable. We have our little end that goes at the bottom of the fork into the derailleur itself, and our long one for the top run. Now, I personally like to run my housing just underneath the pivot clamp, just like the brakes. You can run it through the hole in the pivot clamp itself. For me, I just like running it underneath. It makes it easier to change later. That's personal preference. So once we have our housing in position, then we'll thread our cable through the housing, making sure to be very careful not to kink the cable at any point. We want a nice smooth cable running through this housing. Once we have our housing in place there, we give ourselves a nice matching slack similar to the brakes. We're going to dial our adjustment screw down. Make sure it is shifted all the way into the end position, so we have the most cable slack as possible. Then we route our cable into the stop, and then we route the other end through the derailleur. Now the cable routing goes into the hole here, and then it goes through a pulley. So just be very cautious when running the cable through the pulley. Then we'll insert our housing in the cable stop on the fork. We're going to wrap this up, and we'll run this housing here in a moment through the derailleur. It's very important that we make sure we do the proper routing of the cable through the SRAM derailleur. Okay, we need to take some detailed examination of our cable routing. Here we show the cable going in to the derailleur and then out of the pulley. Once it comes out of the pulley, it's going to go in a slot, as you see in this photo. In order for it to stay in the slot, the cable must go through the small hole that's on the inside at the end of the trough in the derailleur. So here we see the cable going into the trough and then exiting the hole. It's very important that the cable go through that hole so it sits in the trough and doesn't come out. So once the cable comes out of the hole, it will go under the pinch bolt. On the back side, you will see a notch in the washer, and that is how the cable is pinched to the derailleur. Okay, now we can move on to doing an install of the seat. So we're going to take our seat bracket, and we're going to have our two skewers. One skewer is going to go in the seat tube, and the other one's going to go in the bracket. So we'll pre-install one of our seat brackets here. So we have our springs and our washers positioned as shown in the video here. That's going to attach to the seat. The other end of the bracket is going to attach to the seat post, and that will allow us to move the seat angle forward and backward. I suggest putting it in roughly the middle position or so to get started. That'll give you a nice seat angle to begin. Once we have that installed, we can move on to the seat base, which is pre-installed for you from the factory. We're going to have some bolts and special nuts that are going to go into the seat rail on the tube of the frame. And we have those here from our parts bag. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to install 2 of these bolts and nuts on each side of the frame. They'll simply slide right in position. Get them in a rough position here. Now the seat rail will allow you to move the seat forward and backwards, which can help with fit. I recommend setting it roughly in the center to begin for the average size person, roughly, 5'9", 5'11". If you're taller, you might want to set the seat all the way back. If you're a shorter rider, you could set it further forward. Here we have our 6mm Allen. We're going to loosen these bolts a little bit so we have some good clearance. We're going to make sure the washers are all the way to the outside of the bolt heads. And we're going to very carefully get the bracket over the seat rail. Remember, everything is a nice snug fit here. Now we have 2 different positions on the bracket. This will allow you to roughly change the angle of the seat base. So here I'm setting it up with both brackets all the way down. This gives us the lowest seat. So it gives it the lowest seat in the back and also the lowest seat in the front. Once you have your bike done and you are riding, you can change this angle. You can put them both on the lower position, or you can put the front on the upper position to give the front of the seat a little bit of tilt. So you can change that as you see fit. All right, now that we have our seat base in position, we can just simply attach our rear seat bracket to our top seat bracket. Now we can undo the quick release and make sure that that bracket is roughly exiting the seat at about a 90-degree angle. Then we can move on to the rear wheel installation. So our through axle is already in the frame, so we're going to simply loosen that and remove this axle from the frame. We're going to insert our wheel into the dropouts, lining up the rotor with the caliper. And again, we want to grease the threads of our through axle and install our through axle nice and snug. Now, I want to pay special attention to the tool. This is our first use of a standard through axle that has an integrated tool. It's very important not to put too much leverage on this tool. Here we'll adjust our calipers in a moment. But we don't want to over tighten our through axle. So please take note of the through axle instructions. This is a thing you want to check very often. This goes for all through axle bicycles. You want to always check your through axles before each ride to make sure everything's secure. All right, now we're going to do a pedal install. We've removed our pedals from the parts box, and note on the inside of each pedal you'll see a small L or a small R. So the right pedal goes on the chainring side, on the drive side, and the left goes on the non-drive side. We're going to grease these threads, very important. Once we have our threads greased, we can do our pedal install using our included 15mm wrench. Now note this wrench is very short. Pedals need to be nice and secure. This wrench is barely going to do the trick. It's just designed to kind of get them on. I highly recommend using an actual pedal wrench if you have one, or if you are going to be using the included wrench, once you get these pedals on, you want to make them as tight as you can. And if you need to, you can use a small piece of pipe or something to get a little bit more length and leverage on the pedals here. If you have loose pedals, even if they're a little bit loose, they can round out the threaded holes in the cranks. We don't want that to happen. We always want to make sure our pedals are tight. Pedals, just like your through axles, are an item you should check often to make sure that they are secure. Okay, so now we're going to center our calipers. They come loose from the factory. That's so we can do a fit using a T25. Here I have my T25 wrench. Your toolkit includes a small T25. We're going to simply tighten this caliper down. We're going to snug the two bolts holding it to the frame and give it a test. Make sure we don't hear any rubbing. If we do, we can make a slight adjustment back and forth until everything is nice and smooth. Here we're going to loosen it a little bit. We're going to shift it over, test it again. This is a process that you're going to have to go through in order to center the caliper. Get it just right. If you're uncomfortable adjusting things like the shifter on the derailleur and running cables and doing brake adjustment, I highly recommend a bike shop can do this last step for you. But once everything is nice and centered, then we can simply tighten our pinch bolt on the cable, check at the lever for how that feels, and we can give ourselves more or less leverage by adjusting the cable length at the pinch bolt. Okay, now let's go on to some chain installation. We have our quick link here. The chain is a little greasy, so you might want to wear gloves for this step. Now I want to note there's no need to pre-grease this chain. It comes lubed from the factory. The lube on it is fine. There's no need for at least 1,000 miles to be putting grease on your chain. We're going to simply drape it over our chainstay. It only fits one way on the teeth of the chainstay. We're going to drape it over the rear cassette and then around that small cog, which should line up perfectly with our derailleur jockey wheel. Now we're going to pull this forward and we're going to run the cable over the top, avoiding the tab. We don't want to run the chain over the tab in the derailleur cage. And once we have the cage pulled forward, the chain will simply go over the top jockey wheel and then under the rear one. And it will go under the tab there, so nothing is rubbing. And then we can simply let it go back, and then we have a nice smooth chain. Note our quick link has an arrow on it for which direction it faces, with the flat side toward the bottom. We want to install our quick link on the chain with the flat side toward the bottom, and then we want to assemble those two parts. If you can pull it together by hand, that's great. If not, you can always rotate it to the top, backpedal that chain to the top, and then give a little pressure on the front crank and it'll snap into place. Everybody, we're getting close to the end. We're going to install the seat pad next. We have our seat pad. I've given it a pre-bend. I've kind of been flexing it every now and then, so we have a nice bend of the pad. We have our Velcro in the middle and the top and 2 on the base. We're going to get out our 4 included Velcro pieces. Now, it should be noted the adhesive on this Velcro is very strong, so you can't really remove this Velcro on and off. Once you attach it, it's pretty much attached to the seat. So we're going to, I like to estimate where the base of the Velcro goes, which pretty much on the outside of the seat. Now, it isn't critical that it sits all the way inside here in the structure of the seat. But I'm just going to get this Velcro on the seat edge on each side in the same position that the Velcro is on the seat pad. Then we have our other two Velcro pieces for the back. So once we have that, we can attach our seat base. We can properly position the seat pad on the seat. Once that's on, we can attach the Velcro right to the seat pad itself and then pull that protection off and then just attach it to the seat. Okay, let's move on to assembling and installing our kickstand. If you want to use the kickstand, you will need to get out the kickstand mount and our kickstand, which we're going to be using an 8mm Allen to remove the bolt from the top of the kickstand. And that is going to simply install right to the top of the mount. And put a little grease on the threads here. Never a bad idea. Now, the kickstand only goes one direction on this mount. We're going to simply set it on top. And we're going to nicely secure the kickstand to the mount. And once that's in place, we can attach our sides. Now, we're not going to fully tighten down these bolts all the way just yet. We want them to be a little loose. That will allow us to move them into position on the bike frame itself. So here we have our kickstand bracket attached to our kickstand. It should look exactly like this. And those sides should be a little loose. Okay, now here we have our kickstand mounts. These are the threaded holes. The other two are for an underseat rack. So the kickstand mount is simply going to bolt right to the side of the frame using the flat panhead screws. And we're going to gently install these first, get all four of them in before you start tightening them. Once they're all in position, make sure they're all nice and flush and secure. Now our kickstand mount on the bottom can be shifted. Depending on your tire size, you can move it a little bit side to side. I like to shift it all the way to the outside. Now our kickstand is nice and tight. Now note, the kickstand length needs to be adjusted possibly. If it's too short, it won't work. So we want to make sure that the adjustment is correct. So your kickstand should have a certain number of notches showing on the bottom. So note, depending on your tire size, you can adjust this kickstand using a 4mm Allen here. We can loosen this and slide it back and forth and get different lengths. So you want to make sure that you have the proper number of notches here showing on your kickstand. There's 5 notches exposed, and that's what we want for a proper length for the stock setup. Talk the shock position. Here I've moved the shock into the rear position, which gives a more linear feel to the suspension, more bounce, so to speak. If we use our Allens and we simply undo the pinch bolt, we can put the shock in either the forward or the rearward position. In the position it's in currently, I'm showing it in the linear position. The stock position is with the shock up here. So up here in the forward position is how your bike is set up from the factory. With your shock in the forward position, as shown, it's going to have a little bit more progressive feel. That means that as the suspension compresses, it's going to get tighter and tighter. So this is a good position for stock. It's also a good position if you're carrying a lot of heavy loads or you're touring, and it is the stock position. But it is very easy, as you can tell, to change this from one position to the other so you can feel the difference. All right, there you have it. You have successfully assembled your Cruzbike A4x. As always, please consult a local bike shop to do any of those fine tuning of the shifting and the brakes. Always a good idea. Always want you to have a successful cruise bike experience. So if you have questions, please contact us at support@cruzbike.com. Happy riding.